In the gray light of dawn, before the sun has finished its slow climb above the distant ridges, a soldier's breath becomes visible in the cold air. He is one of thousands, standing on a wooden platform barely 2 feet wide, his eyes just clearing the top of a wall made of sandbags. Beyond that wall lies nothing but fog and the brown expanse of broken earth. He does not know yet whether this day will pass quietly or whether by nightfall everything around him will have changed. He knows only that he is here, that he must stay awake, and that somewhere in the darkness ahead the enemy is also waiting. This is the Western Front in the spring of 1916, and this is the moment before a day begins that will teach us something profound about time itself, how a single day can contain an entire world, and how the ordinary, when examined slowly, becomes the most extraordinary thing we can witness. By the time this 24-hour period ends, you will have moved through the hidden architecture of trench warfare, not as a soldier rushing between tasks, but as a silent observer drifting through the spaces where men learn to live in mud and darkness. You will understand the weight of waiting, the smell of damp wool and earth, the precise choreography of rituals that kept thousands of men functioning in conditions that should have broken them. You will learn how time moves differently when you are standing guard at 3 o'clock in the morning, and how a tin of stew becomes not just food, but a moment of profound and unexpected comfort. Most importantly, you will understand that the reality of the trenches was not the screaming chaos of the movies, but something far more subtle, far more human, and far more haunting. The endless grinding routine of men waiting for something they could not predict. And so we begin at the hour just before dawn in the sector held by the British Expeditionary Force, somewhere in the salient that stretches across the muddy landscape between the towns you might recognize from the history book. The sector is quiet this morning. This is not the calm before the storm, or at least not necessarily. It is simply quiet in the way that a trench could be quiet, which is to say that there is no artillery roaring overhead, no machine gun fire stuttering in the darkness, no alarms being sounded. There is only the sound that defines every morning in the trenches, the sound of men moving slowly through mud, the clink of metal on metal as someone adjusts a piece of equipment, the low murmur of voices passing along information from man to man, and underneath it all, the deeper sound of the earth itself, the weight of it, the damp heaviness that seems to press down on everything. The sentry on the fire step, that narrow wooden platform built into the front wall of the trench, is a young man, perhaps 21 years old, though he looks older. His name is Thomas, and he has been in the trenches for 4 months. This is long enough that the constant discomfort has stopped registering as novelty and has instead become the simple texture of existence. He stands with his rifle held loosely in his hands, his eyes scanning the gray landscape before him in a pattern he has repeated so many times that it has become automatic. He looks to the left, then to the right, then straight ahead. His eyes move across the barbed wire that stretches in tangled coils in front of the trench, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that someone or something has passed through during the night. The wire catches what little light there is and throws it back in thin, broken lines. Behind it, the ground rises and falls in gentle undulations, all of it torn and churned by months of shelling, so that it looks less like earth and more like the hide of some vast creature that has been scarred and weathered by time. Thomas's boots are muddy up to the knee. They were cleaned yesterday, or at least someone attempted to clean them, but the mud of the trenches is not like ordinary mud. It is not the kind that dries and flakes away. It is wet, persistent, and it seems to regenerate itself. His socks underneath the boots are damp. They have been damp for so long that he can no longer remember what it felt like to have dry feet. This is not a thought that troubles him, not because he is brave or stoic, but simply because it is no longer a thought at all. It is merely a fact of his body, like the fact that his stomach is hungry, or that his shoulders ache from the weight of the equipment he carries. Behind him, down in the trench itself, the rest of the men are beginning to stir. The night shift is coming to an end, and the day shift is preparing to take their positions. This transition happens twice a day, every day, a slow choreography that has been perfected through months of repetition. No one rushes. There is no need to rush. There is nowhere to go except deeper into the trench or further along its length, and both of those places are already occupied. The trench stretches for miles in both directions, a continuous zigzag of earthworks and wooden wooden supports inhabited by tens of thousands of men, all of them moving through the same routines, all of them waiting for the same thing. The trench itself, if you were to see it from above, would look like a brown scar across the landscape, a line drawn by something wounded that was trying to escape. But from inside it, from where Thomas stands, the trench is a world unto itself. The walls are built up from sandbags, stacked carefully so that they do not collapse, filled with earth and sewn shut with twine. The sandbags are stained dark in places where water has seeped through them, and lighter in others where they have been exposed to the sun. Some of them are so old that the fabric has begun to rot, and you can see the earth beginning to spill out through the tiers. New sandbags are being added all the time, and old ones are being removed. Constant process of repair and replacement that never truly ends. The floor of the trench is not solid earth. That would be impossible because the trench is below the level of the surrounding ground, which means that water is constantly trying to collect in it. Instead, the floor is made of wooden duckboards, long, narrow planks laid end to end, with gaps between them so that water can drain away underneath. But the water does not drain away cleanly. It accumulates in the spaces beneath the duckboards, creating a kind of swamp. When you walk on the duckboards, you can feel them shift slightly under your weight, and if you misstep and place your boot in the spaces between them, your foot plunges into cold water that has been sitting there for days. The air in the trench is thick and damp. It smells of earth, of wet wool, of rust from the metal equipment that is constantly exposed to moisture. There is also the smell of smoke, because despite the moisture, there are always small fires burning somewhere in the trench, in braziers or in the openings of dugouts, because the cold is constant and men need heat, even if the smoke makes their eyes water and their throats raw. Underneath all of these smells is something else, something that no one talks about much. The smell of human bodies that have not been able to bathe in weeks, the smell of latrines, the smell of decay in its smallest, most pervasive form. Thomas has been standing on the fire step for 2 hours. He has another hour to go before he is relieved. The relief will come in the form of Private Crawford, a man of about 30 who was a school teacher before the war and still carries with him a kind of quiet patience that makes him reliable in these long hours of watching. Crawford will climb up onto the fire step and Thomas will climb down, and Crawford will stand in this exact spot and look out at this exact landscape, and Thomas will walk back down the communication trench, that narrow passage that connects the front line to the support trenches behind it, and he will find a spot to sit, and he will close his eyes for a moment, though he will not allow himself to sleep, because there is always work to do, but that is still an hour away. For now, Thomas stands and watches, and as the minutes pass, the gray of the dawn begins to lighten almost imperceptibly. This is not a dramatic lightening, not the sudden appearance of the sun that you might see in other places. This is a slow, diffuse brightening, as though a lamp somewhere very far away is being turned up gradually. The fog that has covered the landscape begins to lift, not all at once, but in patches, revealing small sections of the ground beyond the wire, then obscuring them again as new patches of fog roll in. It is a process that takes nearly an hour, and during that hour, Thomas's job becomes slightly easier, because he can see more clearly, though the increased visibility also brings with it a slight increase in tension, because if he can see the enemy's wire more clearly, then surely the enemy can see his trench more clearly as well. At 6:15 in the morning, a whistle sounds from somewhere down the communication trench. It is a low, two-toned whistle, a signal that means something specific. Thomas knows what it means without having to think about it. It means that breakfast is being served in the regimental mess, which is located in one of the larger dugouts, and any man who is not on active duty can come and collect his ration. Thomas is on active duty, so this does not concern him directly, but he can hear from his position on the fire step the sound of men beginning to move, the shuffle of boots on the duckboards, the clink of mess tins being gathered. 30 yards back from the fire step, in what is called the support trench, the second line of defense that runs parallel to the front line, the cooks have been awake since 4 o'clock in the morning. There are 3 of them, and they work in a dugout that was originally designed as a shelter for officers, but has been converted into a kitchen. The dugout is about 12 feet below the surface of the ground, with wooden supports holding up a ceiling made from corrugated metal sheeting and sandbag. The entrance is protected by a canvas flap, which helps keep some of the cold air out, though it does not keep much out, because the cold is pervasive and determined. The head cook is a man named Sergeant Morris, who has been cooking for the British Army for 17 years. years. He is a large man with a red face, made redder by the heat that radiates from the small brazier that serves as a stove. In front of him on a wooden table are the materials for the morning meal, hard biscuits that have been soaking overnight to make them soft enough to eat, a large pot of weak tea that has been brewed from water heated in a metal container, and several tins of preserved milk, which will be added to the tea to make it slightly more palatable. There is also a large pot of porridge made from oatmeal and water, with no flavoring except for a pinch of salt. The smell of the porridge fills the dugout, warm and thick and not entirely unpleasant, though it is monotonous because this is what the men eat for breakfast almost every day. Sergeant Morris stirs the porridge with a large wooden spoon, moving it through the thick mass with the kind of deliberate, heavy movements that suggest experience. He has made thousands of pots of porridge in his life, and he approaches each one with the same serious attention. The porridge must be stirred constantly, or it will stick to the bottom of the pot and burn, and if it burns, the men will be able to taste it in every spoonful, and their morning will be diminished by this knowledge. So Sergeant Morris stirs, and as he stirs, he thinks about nothing in particular. His mind has learned to empty itself during these repetitive tasks, to exist in a state of simple, uncomplicated focus. The other two, cooks, Privates Marsh and Henderson, are preparing the tea. They work at a table that is lower than Sergeant Morris's because they are younger and smaller. Marsh is holding a large metal pot, while Henderson carefully pours hot water into smaller metal containers, which will be carried out to the various platoons. The hot water is cloudy and slightly brown, and it smells faintly of rust, but by the time the tea is added and the milk is stirred in, no one will notice the rust. They will notice only that the tea is warm and that it is wet, and both of those facts are precious in the trenches. The work in the kitchen dugout is silent except for the small sounds of the work itself. There is no conversation, not because anyone has forbidden it, but because in the early morning, conversation takes energy that the men prefer to preserve for later. Sergeant Morris is not a particularly friendly man, and the two younger cooks understand that he prefers to work in silence. So they work, and they think their own thoughts, and they wait for the moment when the men will begin to arrive to collect their ration. This moment comes at 6:20, exactly 5 minutes after the whistle sounded. The first to arrive is a young private named William, who belongs to the 3rd Platoon and who has become skilled at arriving early enough to ensure that he gets a full portion of porridge. William descends the steps into the dugout carefully because the steps are steep and slippery, and a fall here would be embarrassing and possibly dangerous. He holds out his mess tin, a metal container that has been cleaned roughly the night before and still smells of the stew that was served yesterday. Sergeant Morris fills the tin with a ladle full of porridge, a careful amount that is just slightly more generous than the regulation portion. William notices this generosity, though he does not say anything, because acknowledging kindness in a small way can sometimes cause it to be withdrawn. Instead, he nods, a silent gesture of thanks, and he turns to Marsh to collect his tea. Marsh pours hot water into a second container that William has handed him, and then adds a spoonful of tea leaves, and then a small splash of preserved milk from a tin. The whole process takes perhaps 30 seconds, but to William it feels like a small ceremony, something important and meaningful because his stomach is hungry and because warmth is important. By 6:35, there are perhaps a dozen men waiting in the dugout or on the steps leading into it, all of them holding their mess tins, all of them waiting their turn. Some of them are talking quietly, and some are silent, lost in their own thought. The queue moves slowly, not because there is any obstruction, but because Sergeant Morris is deliberate in his work, and because the men are not in any hurry. Time moves differently in the trenches. There is always time, always too much time, and the one thing that no one lacks is time. So the men wait, and they collect their portions, and they turn and climb back up the steps into the gray morning air. By 7 o'clock, the morning meal has been served to most of the men in the sector. The cooks stand in their dugout, looking at the small amount of porridge and tea that remains. This remaining food will be cleaned and prepared for the midday meal, which will be served at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. For now, Sergeant Morris begins the work of cleaning. He takes the large pot that held the porridge and fills it with water, cold water, because heating more water would be wasteful, and he uses a piece of cloth to scrub the inside of the pot, removing the small bits of porridge that have stuck to the side. Thomas is still on the fire step. His relief has been delayed. This sometimes happens for reasons that are not always clear to the men in the front line. Crawford is somewhere in the support trench, possibly helping with with some other task, possibly sleeping, possibly sitting and writing a letter home to his schoolhouse, but he has not yet arrived to take over the watch. So Thomas remains, his eyes moving in the same pattern they have been moving all morning. Left, right, center, left, right, center. The landscape in front of him has now become fully visible in the pale morning light. He can see every depression in the earth, every strand of barbed wire, the small stones that litter the ground, the bits of cloth and other debris that have been caught on the wire by wind or by some long-forgotten movement. There is nothing to see except what has always been there. There is no movement, no sign of the enemy, no indication that anything is different from yesterday or the day before. This constancy is somehow both reassuring and unsettling. Reassuring because it means that nothing is happening, no attack is imminent, no one is dying this morning. Unsettling because Thomas has learned that this peaceful, static quality of the landscape can change in an instant, that a day that begins with nothing can end with everything. At 7:45, Crawford finally arrives. He is out of breath, which suggests that he has been hurrying, though hurrying is not really possible in the trenches because the passages are narrow and slippery, and a quick movement can result in a fall. Crawford climbs onto the fire step next to Thomas, carefully using the wooden handholds that have been built into the sandbag wall for this purpose. He carries his rifle in his right hand, keeping his left hand free to balance himself. "Morning," Crawford says, his voice quiet and even. "Morning," Thomas replies. Nothing to see. Wires intact, no movement since stand to. This exchange of information is crucial and ancient. It is the passing of knowledge from one person to another, the understanding that has sustained human societies for millennia. One watches, and then another watches, and the knowledge is passed on. Crawford nods and he takes his position on the fire step. Thomas, his shift ended, climbs down carefully. The communication trench that connects the fire step to the support trench is narrow, barely wide enough for two men to pass if they are careful. The walls are made of sandbags and earth, and they are muddy. As Thomas walks through the communication trench, his boots sink slightly into the duckboards, and he has to lift each foot with more effort than he would normally use. The passage takes perhaps 5 minutes of walking, moving at the slow pace that is necessary in these narrow spaces. By 8 o'clock, Thomas has reached the support trench. He is tired, not the tired that sleep will fix, but the kind of tired that comes from standing in one position for 2 hours on a wooden platform in the cold. His legs ache. His hands are numb. He finds a spot against the trench wall, near a small brazier where a few other men are sitting, and he sits down heavily. The spot that Thomas has chosen is protected from the wind by the placement of the sandbag, and the heat from the brazier is welcome. Around him, other men are also sitting, each of them in a small circle of personal space that is respected without having to be negotiated. Some of them are eating the porridge they collected at breakfast. Some of them are simply staring into space, their minds somewhere other than the trench. Some of them are reading letters from home, holding the paper carefully as though it might break, or smoking cigarettes that they have created by rolling tobacco in thin paper. Thomas pulls out his own ration of porridge from his mess tin. It has begun to cool, and it is thicker than when it was first served, but it is still warm enough to be comforting. He eats slowly, lifting the spoon carefully to his mouth, aware of every taste and every texture. The porridge is made from oatmeal, water, and salt. There is nothing else in it. It is not delicious, but it is not meant to be. It is meant to be filling, and it is. With each spoonful, Thomas feels some small portion of warmth enter his body, some small sense of being cared for, even though he knows that no one is particularly caring for him. The porridge is simply what the army provides. Next to Thomas sits a man named Jenkins, who is older, perhaps 35, and who was a stonemason before the war. Jenkins has eaten his porridge already, and he is now smoking a cigarette, holding it between his teeth while he stares out across the trench toward the fire step. Jenkins is a quiet man, and he and Thomas have developed a kind of companionable silence that does not require conversation to sustain it. After a few minutes, Jenkins speaks, his voice soft and conversational. "Quiet night?" he asks. "Very quiet," Thomas replies. "Nothing moved out there." Jenkins nods, as though this confirms something he has suspected or believed. He takes another drag on his cigarette, and the smoke rises up up in front of his face, curling in the slightly moving air. "Good," Jenkins says. "Quiet is good." This exchange might seem simple to someone who has not spent weeks in the trenches, but it contains layers of meaning. Quiet means that the night has passed without alarm. Quiet means that no one has been hurt or killed. Quiet means that one more day has been added to the days they have already survived. The fact of having survived another day is significant, important, something to be grateful for, even if the gratitude is expressed only through a single word: good. Thomas finishes his porridge and scrapes the last bits from the sides of the tin using his spoon. The tin is metal, slightly dented, and worn smooth from the number of hands that have held it. He has carried this tin for 4 months, and it has become almost like a part of him, as familiar and essential as his rifle or his uniform. When he is finished eating, he pours a small amount of water from his canteen into the tin and wipes it clean with his sleeve. This is not a thorough cleaning. There is no soap and the water is cold, but it is enough. By 9 o'clock, the sun has begun to burn off the fog, and the day is becoming warmer. This is not true warmth. The temperature is still cold enough that breath is visible and the dampness is still pervasive, but it is noticeably less cold than it was at dawn. The men begin to move with slightly more purpose. Work details are being organized, and men are being sent to various tasks that must be completed during daylight hours. One of these tasks is the maintenance of the barbed wire in front of the trench. This wire must be checked regularly to ensure that it has not been damaged and that it remains an effective barrier. Today, a detail of 5 men, under the supervision of a lance corporal named Davies, has been assigned to go out into no man's land, that stretch of broken earth that separates the British trench from the German trench, and to inspect and repair the wire. This task is not particularly dangerous on a quiet day because the enemy is not expecting an attack and will not be particularly alert to any movement in their area. But it is still a task that must be approached with care because safety in the trenches is always relative. The 5 men collect their tools, wire cutters, splicing equipment, heavy gloves to protect against the sharp edges of the wire, and they gather near the point in the trench where the wire entanglement begins. Lance Corporal Davies stands in front of them, a man of about 40 who has been in the Army for 15 years and who has learned how to move through dangerous situations with a kind of calm competence. He looks at each of the 5 men, assessing them, making a judgment about whether they are ready for this task. "We'll work in 2 groups," he says, his voice quiet but clear. "One group will stay at the edge of the wire, inspecting the near sections. The other group will move deeper out to check the far sections. We'll take our time. We're in no hurry. If anything seems wrong, if you see anything unexpected, you stop immediately and signal back. No unnecessary movement. No noise. We understand?" The 5 men nod. They understand because they have done this before, or because they have seen others do it, or because they have simply internalized the rules that govern survival in the trenches. The trench at this point has an opening through the barbed wire, not a gap, but a carefully maintained passage where certain sections of wire have been removed and can be replaced. Davies leads the men through this opening, stepping carefully over the wires that remain on either side of the passage. The men follow in single file, each of them moving slowly and deliberately, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of tripwires or other trap. Once they have cleared the trench, they are in no man's land. This is the open space between the trenches, and it feels strangely exposed compared to the relative protection of the trench itself. The ground is broken and uneven, churned up by months of shelling, dotted with shell craters and the remains of things that were destroyed long ago. There are pieces of wood, bits of metal, things that might have been sandbags or might have been something else entirely. There are also, though no one mentions this, the remains of men, bones that have weathered and broken, fragments of uniforms, other things that are better not looked at too closely. The wire entanglement in front of the British trench is extensive. It covers a width of about 40 yards and a depth of about 20 yards, a dense forest of sharp metal that extends outward from the trench in an irregular pattern. The maintenance detail moves carefully through this forest, checking the connections, looking for places where rust might have weakened the wire, looking for gaps that might need to be filled. Davies and 2 of the men work in the near section, moving slowly, checking each connection, occasionally using wire cutters to remove a corroded section that needs to be replaced. The other two men, working under the direction of a senior private named Morrison, move deeper into the wire, farther from the trench. This work is slow and meditative. There is no conversation because any sound carries across no man's land and can be heard by the enemy. Instead, the men communicate through gestures and through the simple observation of each other's movement. When Davies encounters a section of wire that needs to be replaced, he indicates this with a small hand gesture, and one of his companions produces a new section of wire from a bag that he is carrying. The old wire is cut away, the new wire is spliced in place, and the work continues. The process of splicing wire is delicate and precise. You cannot simply tie the wire together because the knot will catch on other wires and create a weakness. Instead, you wrap the new section around the existing wires in a specific pattern, creating a connection that is almost as strong as an unbroken strand. This wrapping takes time, requires both hands, and demands a level of attention that pushes away all other thought. For the men doing this work, there is nothing in the world except the wire, their hands, and the process of connecting. After about 45 minutes of this work, Davies signals that it is time to begin the withdrawal. The men carefully make their way back toward the trench, retracing their steps, moving slowly and carefully. As they approach the passage through the wire, a sound carries across no man's land, the distant report of a rifle shot fired from somewhere in the German line. The men freeze instantly. No one moves, no one speaks. The sound of a single rifle shot does not necessarily mean that they have been spotted, but it means that someone in the German trenches is awake and alert. Everyone waits, breathing slowly, watching for any sign that the shot was directed at them. For perhaps 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then another shot sounds, then another, and then silence. The shots were fired at something or someone, but not at the wire detail. Almost certainly they were fired at movement somewhere else in the line, or they were simply random shots fired to maintain vigilance, but the effect is the same. The men have been reminded that they are not alone, that they are under observation, that danger is always present, even on a quiet day. Davies signals again, and the men move with slightly more speed than before, but they do not run because running creates noise and movement that attracts more attention. They pass through the wire, they reach the trench, and they drop down into the relative safety of the front line. Once everyone is back in the trench, Davies nods to each of the men in turn, a small gesture of acknowledgement. The task has been completed successfully. No one has been hurt. The wire has been maintained. By 11 o'clock, the wire detail has returned to the support trench, and they have reported their work to the sergeant major, who is in charge of maintaining the sector's defenses. The sergeant major is a man named Thornton, a career soldier who has been in the Army for 20 years and who carries himself with an air of quiet authority. Thornton listens to Davies' report without interruption, asks a few brief questions, and then dismisses the men. "Good work," Thornton says, and that is all. But those two words carry significant weight in the trenches because praise is rare and because good work means that the trench is maintained, that the line is secure, that everyone has survived another morning. Thomas has been helping with various small tasks throughout the morning. He has helped to repair a section of the trench wall where the sandbags have begun to settle, filling in the gap with fresh earth. He has helped to clean the rifles that were turned in by the night shift. He has carried water from the well, a hand pump located in the support trench, to refill the various containers that are used throughout the sector. This work is constant and never-ending. It is the work that no one in the outside world thinks about when they think about the trenches. In the movies and in the stories, the trenches are places where men are constantly under attack, constantly dodging bullets, constantly performing acts of courage. But in reality, the trenches are places where men spend most of their time doing simple, repetitive labor. The work of maintaining the trench is important, though, because a well-maintained trench is a safer trench. A trench where the walls are solid and where the duckboards are properly laid is a trench where men are less likely to fall, less likely to turn an ankle, less likely to become injured through simple accident. And in the trenches, where medical care is limited and where an infection can kill as surely as a bullet, the prevention of injury is crucial. By 12 o'clock, the men are beginning to think about lunch. The midday meal will be served at 1 o'clock, and it will be, by by the standards of the trenches, a substantial meal. If everything goes well, it will be a tin of stew thickened with potatoes and carrots and flavored with a small amount of meat that is difficult to identify but present nonetheless. There will also be bread, hard bread that requires some effort to chew, and there will be more tea. The anticipation of food is a form of entertainment in the trenches. Men talk about what they might be having. They exchange memories of previous meals that were particularly good. They imagine what they will eat when the war ends and they return home. Food is one of the few things that has not been taken away from them, one of the few simple pleasures that they can still expect with reasonable regularity. But before the meal is served, there is one more piece of the day's routine that must be completed. Stand to. This is the moment at midday when all the men in the trench stand ready, weapons in hand, prepared to repel an attack. Stand to happens twice a day, at dawn and at dusk, the times when attacks are most likely to occur. It does not happen at noon every day, but today, for reasons that are communicated down through the chain of command, the order has been given that stand to will occur at 12:30, 30 minutes before the meal is to be served. The order passes through the trench quickly, quietly, with the efficiency of long practice. Officers and sergeants move through the trench, checking that every man is in his position, that every rifle is ready, that every man is awake and alert. Thomas makes his way back to the fire step, where he takes his position next to Crawford, who has not been relieved since taking over the watch at 7:45 in the morning. Crawford is tired, but this is expected, and Thomas does not need to ask him if he is all right. They simply stand there, side by side, waiting. The stand to lasts for 15 minutes. During this time, no one talks. No one moves except for the slow scanning of eyes across the landscape. Beyond the wire, the silence is complete, almost absolute, broken only by the small sounds of equipment, the occasional slight movement of someone shifting their weight on the fire step. Nothing happens. No attack comes. No alarm is raised. At 12:45, the order is given to stand down, and the men relax slightly, the tension draining from their bodies, the normal rhythm of the trench returning. By 1 o'clock, the men are lined up outside the kitchen dugout, waiting for their lunch. The smell of the stew has been wafting up from the dugout for the past hour, and the anticipation has become almost tangible. Sergeant Morris has been preparing the stew since before dawn, simmering it slowly in a large metal pot, allowing the flavors to develop, allowing the potatoes and carrots to become soft enough to be palatable. When Thomas reaches the front of the line, he holds out his mess tin. Sergeant Morris ladles the stew carefully, making sure that there is a good ratio of liquid to solid, that there are actual pieces of meat and vegetable in the portion, that the tin is filled nearly to the top. The stew is dark brown, nearly black in places, with flecks of white from the potato and orange from the carrot. The smell is rich and complex, quite different from the porridge that they ate that morning. Thomas finds a spot to sit near the same brazier where he sat that morning. Jenkins is still there, and so are several other men. Thomas begins to eat the stew slowly, blowing on each spoonful to cool it slightly before bringing it to his mouth. The warmth of the food spreads through his body, warming him from the inside in a way that is entirely different from the external warmth of the brazier. The stew is not delicious in any culinary sense. It is made from ingredients that are the cheapest available, prepared in a way that prioritizes efficiency over flavor. But it is hot, and it is sustaining, and it tastes like food, and these facts together make it extraordinary compared to many of the meals that Thomas has eaten in his life. He eats slowly, savoring it, aware that in just a few hours he will be hungry again, and that this meal must sustain him through the afternoon and into the evening. Jenkins is also eating his stew, and between spoonfuls he pulls out a small piece of paper and unfolds it carefully. It is a photograph, worn at the edges, showing a woman and 3 children standing in front of a brick building. Jenkins looks at the photograph while he eats, his eyes moving from the photograph to his stew and back again. "Family?" Thomas asks quietly. Jenkins nods. "Wife and 3 children. The youngest is 2. I haven't met her yet. She was born after I came out here." This is an enormous and impossible fact to contemplate. Jenkins has a daughter that he has never seen, a daughter who was born while he was in the trenches, a daughter who is now 2 years old and whom he has known only through photographs and letters. "What's her name?" Thomas asks. "Eleanor," Jenkins says. "My wife named her Eleanor after my mother." Thomas nods. He does not know what to say, so he says, says nothing. Instead, he returns his attention to his stew, but he is aware that Jenkins is aware that he has noticed something profound, something important, and that no further words are necessary. By 2 o'clock, the men have mostly finished their meals. The cooks are cleaning up the pots in the dugout, and the men are dispersing to their various duties. The afternoon in the trenches follows a different rhythm than the morning. In the morning, the light is still developing, the air is coldest, and there is a kind of expectancy that carries people through the early hours. In the afternoon, the light has become fully established. The temperature has risen slightly, and there is a sense of time passing, of the day moving toward its conclusion. Thomas has been assigned to a work detail that is responsible for carrying supplies from the supply dump, which is located in the reserve trench, a third line of defense that is even farther back from the front line than the support trench. The supplies that must be moved are ammunition, water, and rations for tomorrow's meals. These supplies must be moved at night, when there is less chance of them being spotted from the German lines, but preparations must be made during the day. Thomas and 2 other men are tasked with gathering the supplies that will be moved tonight, organizing them into bundles that are small enough to be carried by a single man, but large enough to minimize the number of trips that must be made. The ammunition is packed in wooden crates, heavy and dense, each crate containing hundreds of rounds. The water is stored in large metal containers, which are also heavy, but are at least not as awkward to carry. The rations are packed in smaller containers, easier to manage, but requiring more individual trips. The work is straightforward and requires little thought, but it requires constant attention to detail. Every item must be accounted for. Every bundle must be secure. Every precaution must be taken to ensure that nothing is lost or damaged. As Thomas and his companions work, they move slowly and methodically, aware that this work is necessary but not urgent, aware that they have time to complete it before darkness falls. Around 3 o'clock, a significant event occurs in the trench. The mail arrives. Mail is carried up from the rear by runners, young soldiers whose primary job is to carry messages and supplies between different sections of the line. Today, the mail runner is a young private named Cooper, who is barely 18 and who still carries with him an air of nervousness, despite the fact that he has been performing this job for 2 months. Cooper arrives in the support trench carrying a small bag containing letters from home, packages from families, and various other items that have been sent to the men in the trenches. The arrival of mail is significant because it is one of the few connections that the men have with the world outside the trenches, one of the few reminders that there is a world beyond this small, contained, muddy universe. The mail is distributed by rank, with the officers receiving their mail first and then the enlisted men receiving theirs in the order that the sergeant major indicates. Most men receive at least 1 or 2 letters during any given mail call. Some men receive packages as well, small parcels containing things that their families have sent, extra socks, chocolate, tobacco, letters from sweethearts or parents or siblings. Thomas receives a single letter in an envelope that is thin enough that it must contain only 1 or 2 pages. The letter is from his mother, and he recognizes the handwriting immediately, the careful, deliberate letters that she has used since Thomas was a child. He opens the envelope carefully, protecting the letter from the damp air, and he begins to read. The letter is short, as most letters from home are. His mother writes that everyone is well, that the weather has been cold, that she is praying for his safety every day. She tells him about his younger sister, who has taken a job at the local factory, and about his father, who continues to work at the ironwork. She tells him that she loves him and that she thinks about him every day, and she tells him that she hopes the war will end soon and that he will be able to come home. Thomas reads the letter slowly, several times, absorbing every word, understanding the effort that his mother has made to send this letter to him, to maintain this connection across the distance that separates them. He folds the letter carefully and tucks it into the inside pocket of his uniform, against his chest, where it will remain until it falls apart from being read and reread. Jenkins also receives a letter, and he recognizes the handwriting of his wife. He opens it and reads it quickly, his eyes moving fast, as though he is trying to absorb all of the information as quickly as possible. When he has finished, he does not fold the letter and tuck it away. Instead, he He sits with it in his hands, looking at the words on the page, his expression soft and distant. The arrival of mail brings a kind of melancholy to the trench. For a moment the men are connected to their homes, to their families, to the people they love, and the people who love them. And then, as they finish reading their letters and tucking them away, they are returned to the present moment, to the trench, to the reality of where they are and what they are doing. The contrast between the world of the letters and the world of the trenches is so stark that it creates a kind of pain, a longing for something that is impossible in the moment. By 4 o'clock, the afternoon is beginning to wear on. The light, which has been increasing gradually since dawn, has reached its peak and has begun a slow decline toward evening. The quality of the light changes, becoming more golden, more angular, creating longer shadows on the trench wall. This change in light is one of the small markers that divide the day into sections, one of the ways that time is measured in the trenches. Thomas has finished his work on the supply bundles, and he is now resting. He sits against the trench wall, his back to the sandbags, his eyes closed. He is not sleeping, because sleep in the trenches is difficult and often comes at unexpected times. Instead, he is resting in a state between wakefulness and sleep, his mind drifting from thought to thought without following any particular thread. He thinks about his mother, about her hands, and how they always seem to be moving, working, creating things. He thinks about the letter that he received and how seeing her words written in her handwriting made him feel connected to her across the vast distance. He thinks about whether he will receive another letter, and when that might be, and whether his mother is thinking about him right now, in this moment, across the distance of hundreds of miles. These thoughts are not painful exactly, but they are poignant, touching something in him that is both tender and strong. They remind him of who he was before the war, and they remind him that there is a person waiting for him at home who loves him and who wants him to survive this experience and return to her. Around 5 o'clock, the men begin to prepare for evening. This preparation is similar to the preparation for morning, but with some differences. In the morning, the focus is on standing to, on being ready to repel an attack that might come as the light increases and visibility improves. In the evening, the focus is on preparing for darkness, on securing the line, on making sure that no one can slip through the wire or sneak across no man's land under cover of night. The twilight period in the trenches, the time between full daylight and full darkness, is a tense time. During this time, visibility is poor, neither daylight nor darkness, and it is possible for someone to move across the ground between the trenches without being clearly seen. So during twilight, stand to is held again. The men stand ready, weapons in hand, waiting for the moment when darkness falls completely and the light becomes certain enough that the danger of attack decreases. Thomas takes his position on the fire step again, next to Crawford, who has been relieved during the afternoon but has been assigned to stand the evening watch. They stand in silence, their eyes scanning the landscape, which is now beginning to lose definition as the light fails. The shapes of the shell craters and the pieces of debris in no man's land become less distinct, more shadowed, more mysterious. The stand-to lasts until 6 o'clock, when full darkness has arrived. At this point, the men stand down again, but the atmosphere remains somewhat tense. Darkness brings with it a different kind of danger. It is during darkness that patrols are sent out, that raids are conducted, that men move across no man's land with the goal of inflicting damage on the enemy or gathering information about the enemy's positions. Tonight, no patrol has been ordered and no raid is planned. The night is meant to be quiet, a continuation of the quiet day. But the men do not know this with certainty. It is possible that an order will come at any moment, an order to prepare for a patrol or to stand ready for an enemy attack. This uncertainty is one of the defining characteristics of life in the trenches, the fact that you do not know what is going to happen, and you must be ready for anything. By 6:30, darkness has become complete. The darkness in the trenches at night is absolute, almost tangible. There is no light from the moon or stars because the weather is still somewhat overcast, and even if it were clear, the darkness seems to come from something deeper than the absence of light. It comes from being below the level of the ground, from being in a place that is meant to be dark, a place where darkness is part of the design. Lanterns are lit in certain places in the trench, dimmed lanterns with the light covered forward so that it does not escape and become visible to the enemy. These lanterns provide enough light for men to move through the trench without falling or injuring themselves on unseen obstacles. But the light they provide is weak and inadequate, and the shadows they create are deep and impenetrable. Dinner is served at 7 o'clock. The meal consists of bully beef, canned meat that is high in fat and salt, mixed with biscuits that have been soaked in water to make them soft. There is also a small amount of jam, made from a preserve that is not quite fruit and not quite sugar, but something in between. The meal is less substantial than the lunch, and it does not have the warmth that the stew provided, but it is food, and the men eat it with the same quiet acceptance with which they eat all of their meals. Thomas collects his portion and finds a place to sit. He eats alone this time, Jenkins having been assigned to a different section of the trench for the night. The bully beef is cold and congealed, and it requires effort to chew, but Thomas eats it methodically, spoonful by spoonful, understanding that this food is necessary, that his body needs the fuel to maintain itself through the night. By 8 o'clock, the night has fully settled into the rhythm that characterizes most nights in the trenches. The men who are not on sentry duty have found places to rest, and some of them are sleeping, curled up against the trench wall, their packs and equipment serving as pillows. Others are sitting and talking quietly, sharing their time with companions, finding comfort in conversation and companionship. Thomas makes his way down the communication trench to the place where he sleeps, a small alcove in the wall of the trench that has been partially lined with boards and covered with a piece of canvas to provide some minimal protection from the rain and wind. His bedding consists of a blanket, which he has folded into a roughly rectangular shape, and another blanket, which he uses as a cover. This is not a comfortable bed by any standard, but it is familiar, and it provides some insulation from the cold and dampness. He lies down on his bedding and arranges the covering blanket over himself. The ground beneath him is hard and uneven, and he can feel the moisture from the earth even through the board and the blanket. His body, however, has become accustomed to this discomfort, and despite the hardness, he feels a kind of relaxation beginning to overtake him. But before he can sleep, he must carry supplies. At 9 o'clock, the night work detail is assembled, and Thomas, as scheduled, is part of this detail. He must rise from his rest, gather the supply bundles that he and his companions prepared earlier in the day, and make the journey to the front line to deliver them to the men who are on duty. This journey is made in darkness, moving slowly and carefully through the communication trench. The supplies are heavy, and the darkness is nearly complete, despite the dimmed lanterns. Each man in the detail carries what he can manage, and the journey, which takes perhaps 10 minutes in daylight, takes nearly 30 minutes at night. Thomas carries a bundle of ammunition, the wooden crate heavy against his chest, his arms wrapped around it, his feet carefully feeling their way forward on the duckboards. He moves slowly, matching the pace of the man in front of him, maintaining a distance that allows him to feel safe, but does not separate him so far that he loses sight of his guide. When the detail reaches the fire step, the ammunition is carefully unloaded and stored in a dugout that has been built specifically for this purpose. The ammunition is precious and must be kept relatively safe from the damp and from accidental damage. Once the ammunition is unloaded, the crates must be carried back to the supply dump, and the detail must make the return journey. This work takes several hours. By the time Thomas has completed his work and made his way back to his rest position, it is nearly midnight. He is tired now, the kind of tired that pushes sleep forward, that makes rest feel necessary and inevitable. He lies down again on his bedding, and this time sleep comes quickly. His mind does not drift through memories or thoughts. Instead, it simply ceases functioning in any complicated way, and his body takes over, demanding the rest that it needs. The night in the trenches is long and quiet. The darkness is vast and seems to press down on everything. But within this darkness, there is a kind of rhythm, a kind of pattern that the men have learned to follow. At 11 o'clock, the sentries on the fire step are relieved by fresh sentries. At 1 o'clock in the morning, more supplies are moved, and more men go through the process of carrying them forward. At 3 o'clock, there is a moment of heightened alertness when it seems, for no reason that anyone can articulate, that danger might be close. But the night passes without incident. There are no attacks, no alarms, no sudden eruptions of violence. The night is, in fact, quieter than the day has been, because the darkness brings with it a kind of caution, a kind of stillness that everyone seems to respect. Thomas sleeps through most of this night, his sleep deep and dreamless, his body simply resting, simply recovering from the expenditure of the day. Around 3 o'clock he stirs slightly, his consciousness returning for a moment, registering the coldness and the dampness, registering the weight of the blanket that is insufficient to keep him truly warm. But then sleep takes hold again, and he sinks back into the darkness that is identical to the darkness surrounding the trench. At 4 o'clock the cooks begin their work again, preparing breakfast for the men who will be awake and hungry in another hour. Sergeant Morris lights the small stove in the kitchen dugout, and he begins to fill his large pot with water. The water will be heated, and the tea leaves will be added, and the morning routine will begin again, just as it began yesterday, just as it will begin tomorrow. At 5 o'clock, Thomas is awakened by the soft sound of the whistle that signals the beginning of the morning watch. He does not want to awaken, his body protesting the loss of sleep, his mind still caught in the edges of dream. But he rises nonetheless, gathering his equipment, preparing himself for the day that is about to begin. He has slept perhaps 5 hours, which is more sleep than he usually gets, and yet it seems insufficient, seems to have barely touched the deep exhaustion that he carries. He makes his way back toward the support trench where breakfast is beginning to be served. He collects his porridge and his tea, and he sits near the brazier, warming his hands on the metal bowl of tea, feeling the heat penetrate the numbness that the cold night has created. And so the 24-hour cycle completes itself, and another day begins, identical in almost every way to the day that has just passed. The same duties will be performed, the same meals will be eaten, the same men will stand guard and look out at the same landscape, the same supplies will be moved, the same work will be done, the same letters will be received from home, the same quiet acceptance of discomfort and danger will continue. But this cycle, repeated day after day, month after month, creates something profound. It creates a kind of community, a kind of shared understanding that transcends the normal bonds of friendship or family. It creates a knowledge, deep and bone level, of what it means to survive, of what it means to endure, of what the human body and mind can adapt to and accept. The trench is not a place that anyone would choose to be. It is cold and wet and dangerous and boring and exhausting, and filled with the constant, low-level dread that comes from knowing that at any moment everything could change, that peace could become violence, that routine could become chaos. And yet, within this terrible place, the men have created something that, if not good, is at least bearable. They have created routines that provide comfort, rituals that create meaning, moments of connection that remind them that they are not alone. The 24 hours that we have observed, from 6 o'clock in the morning when Thomas stood on the fire step and looked out at the fog-covered landscape, to 6 o'clock in the morning of the next day when another soldier stood on the same fire step and looked out at the same landscape, contains the essence of what the trenches were. It does not contain the dramatic moments of battle or the moments of intense danger. It contains instead the long, slow, grinding reality of waiting, of enduring, of surviving through the accumulation of small moments, small comforts, small connections with other people who are enduring the same thing. The memory of these 24 hours, if we imagine that we have truly been there, observing, drifting like a ghost through the spaces where men lived and worked and slept and waited, would stay with us. We would remember the smell of damp wool and earth. We would remember the taste of the stew, not delicious, but warm. We would remember the weight of the ammunition crate, the feel of the rifle in our hands, the sound of the whistle that marked the passage of time. We would remember Jenkins looking at the photograph of his family, and Thomas reading his mother's letter, and Crawford standing silently on the fire step, watching the landscape that never changed. And we would understand, in a way that is different from understanding it intellectually, what the trenches meant to the men who were there. We would understand that the trenches were not the place of constant action and constant danger that popular culture has portrayed. They were instead a place where time moved slowly, where the ordinary became profound, where human beings learned to adapt to conditions that should have been impossible. The dawn breaks again, and another day begins in the trenches. The men who lived through this day and the thousands of days like it were shaped by this experience in ways that no one who has not lived through it can fully understand. They learned what their bodies could endure. They learned what it meant to live without privacy, without comfort, without hope of anything other than survival. They learned to find meaning in small moment, in the warmth of a cup of tea, in the arrival of mail from home, in the quiet camaraderie of men who were enduring the same thing. The Western Front stretches for hundreds of miles, from the English Channel in the north to Switzerland in the south. In 1916, this entire line is filled with trenches, millions of men living in conditions like those we have just observed, all of them following the same routines, all of them waiting, all of them enduring. The scale of this is almost incomprehensible. The number of men, the amount of earth that has been moved, the quantity of supplies that must be moved every day, all of it exists in a kind of vast, grinding machinery that consumes resources and human lives with an indifference that is almost mechanical. And yet, within this vast machinery, there are individuals, each of them with their own thoughts, their own hopes, their own connections to people and places outside the trenches. Thomas, at this moment of dawn on the second day of his 24-hour cycle, is thinking about whether he will receive another letter from his mother. Jenkins is thinking about his daughter Eleanor, whom he has never met, and wondering what she looks like and whether she will recognize him when he finally returns home. Crawford is standing on the fire step, his mind empty, his attention focused entirely on the landscape in front of him, his consciousness contracted to the single task of watching and waiting. The morning mist is beginning to rise from the ground, and the landscape is becoming obscured again, just as it was obscured yesterday. The dawn of the second day is proceeding in exactly the same way as the dawn of the first day, and tomorrow, if the war continues as it is continuing, the dawn of the third day will proceed in exactly the same way. This repetition, this absolute sameness, is both comforting and terrible. It is comforting because it means that the men can predict what will happen, can prepare themselves mentally for what is coming. It is terrible because it means that there is no variation, no escape, no possibility of things being different. But the men have learned to live with this. They have learned to take comfort where they can find it. They have learned to find meaning in the small moments and the small connection. And they have learned to endure day after day in conditions that would have seemed impossible to them before they arrived at the front. The 24 hours that we have observed is simply one day out of the thousands of days that make up the First World War. It is a day that stands for all the other days that are like it, all the days of routine and waiting and small moments of connection. It is a day that, while containing nothing that would be considered extraordinary or dramatic in the context of the war, contains everything that is essential to understanding what the war meant to the men who lived through it. As we move away from this 24-hour period, as we return to our own time and our own world, the reality of the trench begins to fade, becomes less real, less immediate, but the memory of it remains, the understanding that we have gained about what it meant to endure, what it meant to survive, what it meant to be human in a situation that was designed to destroy everything that is human about a person. The men in the trenches at this moment in 1916 do not know that the war will continue for 2 more years. They do not know how many more 24-hour cycles they will have to endure, how many more dawns they will see, how many more nights they will spend in the cold and the dark. They know only that today is today, that they must endure it, and that there will be another day tomorrow that they must endure as well. This is the wisdom that the trenches teach. This is the knowledge that comes from being in a place where the future is unknowable and the past is increasingly distant. There is only the present moment and the survival of that moment. There is only the cup of tea in the morning, the work that must be done in the afternoon, the rest that is taken at night. There is only the next 24 hours, and the 24 hours after that, and the 24 hours after that, extending into a future that cannot be known. And as we settle into this knowledge, as we begin to understand what it meant to live in the trenches, the world around us begins to slow. The rush and noise of the outside world begins to fade. We are left with the quiet sounds of the trench, the soft footfalls on duckboards, the clink of equipment, the low murmur of voices. We are left with the small moments of connection, the letters from home, the warm tea, the simple fact of having survived another day. The 24 hours in the trench has passed now. We have moved through it, observed it, experienced it as fully as we can, without truly being there. And now, as we return to ourselves, as we prepare to rest and to sleep, we carry with us the understanding of what we have learned. The trenches were a place where ordinary men faced extraordinary circumstances with quiet courage. They were a place where routine became sacred, where small moments became profound, where the simple fact of human connection became the most valuable thing in the world. They were a place where time moved differently, where a single day could contain an entire lifetime of experience, where waiting became the primary occupation and endurance became the primary virtue. The morning light is beginning to increase now, as it does on every morning. The men are stirring, rising, preparing themselves for another day. The cycle continues, the routine continues, the waiting continues. And somewhere, in a place far away from the trenches, people are beginning their own days, unaware of the reality of what is happening in this place, unaware of the men who are enduring conditions that should be impossible. But the men in the trenches know. They know the reality of their situation with a clarity that those in the distant places cannot access. They know because they are living it, because they have adapted to it, because they have learned to find meaning and connection within it. And so we leave them now, at the moment when the second day is beginning, when the first 24 hours have come to an end. We leave them with the knowledge that they will continue, that they will endure, that they will find ways to survive and to maintain their humanity in a place that was designed to strip it away. The 24 hours in the trenches is not a dramatic story. It does not contain the moments of glory or the moments of heroic action that popular culture celebrates. It is instead a story of the ordinary, the mundane, the repetitive. It is a story of men learning to live in conditions of almost impossible discomfort and danger, finding peace not in the absence of difficulty, but in the acceptance of it, in the learning to endure, in the development of routines and rituals that allow the human mind and body to function when they should be broken. And as we conclude our observation of these 24 hours, as we prepare to leave this world and return to our own, we are left with a profound sense of gratitude for the fact that we do not have to endure such conditions, and a profound sense of respect for those who did, who faced each day with quiet acceptance, who learned to find meaning in small moments, who survived the unsurvivable. The mist is rising from the ground again. Another day is beginning in the trenches, and we, having spent 24 hours in this place, understanding what the men endured, what they survived, what they learned about themselves and about the nature of human endurance, are now settling back into stillness, into the peace of knowing, into the gentle rest that comes from having traveled far and understood deeply. The cycle continues, the days continue, the men continue to endure, and we continue to remember what we have learned, carrying it with us into our own lives, letting it change us in quiet ways, letting it teach us about what it means to be human, to endure, to survive, to find meaning in the small moments that make up a life. The 24 hours has come to an end, but the understanding remains, and as we rest now, as we close our eyes and allow sleep to take us, we carry with us the knowledge of what we have witnessed, what we have learned, and what it means to have been there, truly there, for those hours in the quiet, waiting, enduring reality of the trenches.